The morning assembly bell rang in harmonics that human ears weren't quite designed to process. Too many overtones, frequencies that made Marcus Webb's teeth ache if he thought about it too much. He'd learned not to think about it. 3 years in-house, Veltharian service had taught him that survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant ignoring the things that made him uncomfortable. The servants' hall was a study in efficient architecture, all smooth crystalline surfaces that seemed to absorb sound and light in equal measure. 200 staff members arranged themselves in precise ranks according to function and species, a living hierarchy rendered in posture and spacing. Administrative personnel stood closest to the elevated platform where Overseer Keltine would deliver the day's assignments. Behind them, the skilled workers, craftspeople, technicians, those whose expertise granted them slightly elevated status. And in the back, barely visible in the hall's carefully calibrated lighting, the general servants who performed the invisible labor that kept the palace functioning. Marcus stood in the middle ranks, his position as archive assistant granting him a marginal improvement over the lowest tiers. He kept his spine straight, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes focused on the middle distance, the posture of someone present but not presumptuous. The overseer emerged onto the platform with the fluid grace that characterized high-ranking ascendancy citizens. His skin shifting through subtle shades of blue that indicated professional detachment. He began the morning ritual in formal ascendancy standard, each word precise and clipped. Household staff attend. Today's assignments follow established protocols. Archives. Continue cataloging the tertiary collection, Section 7. Kitchen. Preparations for the evening's diplomatic reception require early start. Maintenance. The East Wing's environmental systems require calibration. Housekeeping. Marcus's attention wandered slightly during the housekeeping assignments, his mind already organizing his own tasks for the day. The tertiary collection was a nightmare of poorly organized historical documents that someone 3 generations ago had decided to preserve without any coherent classification system. He was making progress slowly, though nobody seemed to care whether he finished this year or next decade. His wandering focus caught on a figure in the housekeeping ranks, a Kelari woman whose pale lavender skin marked her as one of the species the ascendancy considered particularly suited for domestic service. 6-fingered hands, exceptional dexterity, and a cultural tendency toward meticulous attention to detail made them valuable as servants. She stood with the proper posture, but something was off. A slight shift in her weight favoring her right leg, a tightness around her eyes that suggested suppressed discomfort. Marcus filed the observation away, unsure why it registered at all. 3 years had taught him that noticing things didn't change them. That observation without action was the safest path through House Veltharian's complicated social structure. The assembly concluded with the overseer's standard reminder: efficiency through discipline, service through dedication. House Veltharian honors those who honor their duties. The staff dispersed with practiced choreography, each person flowing toward their assigned tasks without unnecessary conversation. Marcus made his way through corridors that changed color based on ambient mood, currently a neutral gray-green that suggested general productivity, toward the archives. The archive room was his sanctuary, a space where he could work in relative isolation, surrounded by documents that couldn't judge him or enforce hierarchy. He settled into his workstation, pulling up holographic displays of catalog entries and cross-referencing them with the physical documents stored in crystalline preservation units. Hours passed in comfortable routine. Marcus worked through documents dating back to the second expansion, carefully categorizing treaties and trade agreements and diplomatic correspondence that probably mattered to someone but felt profoundly irrelevant to his daily existence. Midday brought the brief rest period, 30 minutes when servants were allowed to attend to personal needs. Marcus usually spent it in the archives, eating the standard ration pack while continuing his work. Today, Restlessness drove him into the servants' corridors, the utilitarian passages that connected the palace's working areas. He found the Kalari woman Naive, he remembered from morning assembly, sitting on a storage crate in an alcove off the main corridor. Her injured leg was extended, and she was pressing careful fingers against the swelling visible even through her uniform pants. Marcus stopped walking, uncertain why this particular moment of pain among thousands demanded his attention. The palace was full of suffering, small and large. People worked through injuries, through illness, through exhaustion. That's what service meant. Noticing didn't change anything. But he found himself approaching anyway, his footsteps loud against the floor in a way that made Naive's head snap up. She immediately stood, resuming proper servant posture despite the obvious pain, despite the way her injured leg trembled under her weight. "I'm fine," she said in accented standard before Marcus could speak. "I must return to my duties." Marcus studied her face, the professional mask that servants learn to wear, the careful blankness that said, "I am a function, not a person." He'd perfected the same expression himself. "Your leg is injured," he said, keeping his voice quiet. Unsolicited interaction between servants was discouraged. The administrative staff worried about coalition building, about servants developing loyalties that might supersede their dedication to service. "It's nothing, a minor inconvenience, I can work through it." Of course she could work through it. That's what everyone did. Admitting injury meant explaining how it happened, which might imply carelessness, which could result in punishment or dismissal. Better to suffer quietly than risk administrative attention. Marcus made a decision that violated every survival instinct he'd developed over 3 years. He knelt before her, the gesture so unexpected that Naive actually gasped. "May I look at it?" he asked. You don't need to, I'm nobody important." "That's not how importance works where I come from." He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening, as if approaching a frightened animal. Slowly, Naive lowered herself back onto the storage crate, extending her injured leg with obvious reluctance. Marcus examined the swelling carefully, noting the heat radiating from the area, the slight discoloration that suggested infection. "What happened?" "I caught it on a sharp edge while cleaning the ventilation shafts. 3 days ago. I thought it would heal on its own." "It's infected. You need medical attention." "I can't request medical care. It would require explaining the injury. The overseer would ask questions about how I was careless enough to hurt myself. It's better to just wait for it to heal naturally." Marcus sat back on his heels, processing this logic that made perfect sense within the palace's social structure, and absolutely no sense within his human framework of compassion. "Wait here," he said. "I really should return to my duties." "5 minutes, please." He left before she could protest further, making his way to the medical supply storage that all staff theoretically had access to for minor injuries. In practice, most servants were too afraid to take anything, worried that using resources might be seen as presumptuous. Marcus had spent 3 years being invisible. Today, he decided visibility was worth the risk. He returned with antiseptic, clean bandages, and a small packet of pain medication, kneeling again before Naive, who looked at him like he'd manifested from another dimension. "This will sting," he warned, opening the antiseptic. "But it'll prevent the infection from spreading." He cleaned the wound with methodical care, explaining each step in his limited standard mixed with gestures when words failed. Naive sat in frozen silence, her 6 fingers gripping the edge of the storage crate, her expression cycling through confusion and disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. When he finished bandaging her leg, Marcus offered her the pain medication. "Take this tonight before you sleep, and try to rest the leg as much as you can. I know that's nearly impossible given the work schedule, but even small amounts of rest will help." "Why are you doing this?" Naive asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus packed up the medical supplies, considering the question. "Because you're hurt, because I could help, because that's what people should do for each other." We're not people, we're servants. There's a difference. No, Marcus said firmly, there really isn't. He left before she could respond, before he could second-guess his actions, before the weight of what he'd just done could fully settle on him. His hands were shaking slightly as he returned to the archives, the adrenaline of breaking rules finally catching up with his nervous system. He'd helped someone, a simple act that his mother would have considered basic human decency. An act that, in the context of House Veltharion, might have consequences he couldn't predict. Marcus returned to cataloging documents, trying to focus on treaties that were centuries old, trying to ignore the fact that he just crossed a line that most servants knew better than to approach. Outside the archive windows, the palace spires shifted through colors that indicated evening approaching. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, Naive was probably trying to understand why a human had knelt before her, treated her injury, shown her kindness that defied every rule of status and species. Marcus didn't have a good answer for her. He barely had an answer for himself. Sometimes, he thought, the right thing to do was obvious even when the consequences weren't. The servants' corridor during afternoon rest period existed in a state of suspended activity, people moving efficiently between tasks, grabbing quick meals, attending to personal needs with the hurried quality of those who knew their time was limited. Marcus had learned to navigate these spaces by making himself small, by avoiding eye contact, by becoming a ghost that other servants registered but didn't really see. Today, he was looking for someone specific. He found Naive near the service entrance to the eastern wing, sitting on the same storage crate from 3 days ago. Her injured leg was extended again, and she was pressing careful fingers against the bandage he'd applied. When she noticed Marcus approaching, she stood immediately, resuming proper posture despite the obvious improvement in her movement. "The swelling has reduced significantly," she said before he could speak, her accented standard carrying a note of wonder. "The pain is manageable now. I can work without significant difficulty." "That's good," Marcus replied, "but you should still be careful with it. Infections can return if you stress the injury too soon." They stood in awkward silence, two servants who'd broken protocol by acknowledging each other's humanity, unsure how to navigate the aftermath of that transgression. "I wanted to thank you properly," Naive finally said, her six-fingered hands twisting together in a gesture that Marcus had learned indicated Kellari nervousness. "What you did, helping me without obligation, without expectation of reciprocation, is not common behavior, especially not across species lines. Where I come from, helping injured people isn't considered unusual. It's just basic decency. You are not from here. It wasn't a question. The ascendancy operates on different principles. Service is a calling. Suffering is expected. Individual pain matters less than collective efficiency." Marcus had heard variations of this philosophy for 3 years, always delivered in tones that suggested these principles were self-evidently correct. He'd never quite managed to internalize them. "I don't think I'll ever understand that way of thinking," he admitted. "Most of us don't understand it either," Naive said quietly, glancing around to ensure no administrative staff were within earshot. "We simply accept it because resistance is futile and adaptation is survival." She hesitated, then continued. "There is a saying among my people from before we joined the ascendancy. Kindness is the first language spoken before words existed. You reminded me of that. I had forgotten." Before Marcus could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor, the deliberate, measured pace of someone with authority. Both servants immediately shifted posture, became properly invisible, as Overseer Keltine appeared around the corner with a data tablet in hand. He stopped when he noticed them, his skin shifting through shades that Marcus had learned to interpret. Surprise, then assessment, then something approaching concern. "Webb, Naive, you are both scheduled for duties during this period. Explain your presence in this corridor." "Rest period, Overseer," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. "We're within the allotted break time." "Indeed. Keltine studied them both with uncomfortable attention. I've heard interesting reports about you, Webb. Something about unauthorized medical intervention with household staff. Marcus felt his stomach drop but kept his expression carefully blank. I helped a colleague who was injured. Is that against regulations? That depends on your definition of help. Medical care is channeled through proper administrative oversight to ensure efficiency and documentation. Individual servants making independent decisions about healthcare creates variables that complicate resource allocation. She had an infected wound. I had basic medical supplies. The logic seemed straightforward. Logic, Keltine repeated, the word carrying tones that suggested humans and ascendancy citizens operated on fundamentally different definitions of that concept. You are aware that cross-species interaction among servants is generally discouraged. I was not aware that compassion had species restrictions. The words came out more sharply than Marcus intended. Naive made a small sound, whether alarm or suppressed laughter, he couldn't tell. Keltine's skin shifted to a deep blue that indicated thought processing. You pose an interesting challenge, Webb. You follow rules adequately when those rules make sense to you, but you seem to operate on a parallel ethical framework that occasionally diverges from established protocols. This is problematic. I apologize if my actions caused administrative complications, Marcus said, falling back on the proper deferential language. That was not my intention. I don't require your apology. I require your compliance with household efficiency standards. Keltine paused. However, I am told that Naive's productivity has actually improved following your intervention. Her work quality has increased, and she's completed tasks ahead of schedule. This suggests that your unauthorized medical attention had positive outcomes, which creates a documentation anomaly that I don't quite know how to classify. He studied his data tablet with the expression of someone encountering a problem that didn't fit established categories. I will note in my reports that individual initiative in matters of basic medical care may, under specific circumstances, align with household efficiency goals. This is not approval of your actions, Webb. Consider it acknowledgement of complicated variables. Keltine departed with the same measured pace, leaving Marcus and Naive standing in the corridor trying to process what had just happened. I think he almost complimented you, Naive said once the overseer was safely out of earshot. That may be unprecedented. I think he couldn't figure out how to punish me when the results were objectively positive. That's not the same as approval. In the ascendancy, not being punished is essentially the same as approval. Naive's expression shifted to something approaching a smile, subtle but present. You confuse them, Webb. They don't know what to do with humans who operate on compassion rather than hierarchy. Is that a compliment or a warning? Both probably. They returned to their respective duties, but something had shifted in the servants' social atmosphere. Other staff members who'd witnessed the exchange in the corridor spread word through whispered conversations during work periods. The human had helped the Kalari. The overseer had acknowledged it without punishment. Variables were changing in ways that made the future slightly less predictable. That evening, during the communal meal period in the servants' common area, Marcus noticed the change most clearly. Where normally he sat alone, humans being rare enough in ascendancy service that he existed in social isolation, tonight several servants chose seats near him. Not directly beside him, but close enough to constitute acknowledgement. Saris, the young kitchen worker he'd noticed during morning assembly, actually spoke to him directly. I heard what you did for Naive. That was good. It was nothing special, Marcus said, uncomfortable with the attention. It was extraordinary, Saris corrected gently. Nobody helps each other here. We're all too afraid of drawing attention, of breaking protocols, of risking our positions. You helped anyway. That matters. Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. So Thelman, the elderly servant who'd worked in House Veltharion for 4 decades, approached Marcus's table with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer cooperated with their intentions. "May I sit?" he asked formally. "Of course." Thelman lowered himself onto the bench with a wince that he tried to hide. "I feel obligated to warn you, young human. What you did for Naive was kind. It was also dangerous. The Ascendancy tolerates many things, but individual initiative that challenges established hierarchies makes them nervous. You've shown that servants can care for each other outside official channels. That's a revolutionary concept, even if you didn't intend it that way. I just helped someone who was hurt. How is that revolutionary? Because you treated her as an equal deserving of care, not as a function that needed repair. That distinction matters more than you realize." Thelman studied Marcus with eyes that had seen too much suffering to maintain hope but hadn't quite abandoned it entirely. "Be careful. Change is dangerous, even when it's necessary." Marcus absorbed the warning, understanding that Thelman spoke from experience, from years of watching servants who pushed boundaries face consequences that ranged from dismissal to worse. But he also understood something else, that sometimes danger was the price of maintaining your humanity in a system designed to erase it. "I'll be careful," Marcus promised, "but I won't stop helping people who need it." Thelman nodded slowly. "I know that's what worries me. That's also what gives me hope." The meal period ended, and servants dispersed back to their duties or quarters. Marcus returned to his small room in the staff housing section, a space barely large enough for a sleep platform and storage unit, but private, which was luxury in servant terms. He lay awake longer than usual, thinking about Naive's healing leg, about Keltain's confused acknowledgement, about Saris's simple statement that helping had been extraordinary. In 3 years at House Veltharion, Marcus had learned to survive by being invisible, by following rules, by not making waves that might capsize his precarious stability. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered if survival was enough. If being invisible meant being complicit in a system that treated people as functions rather than individuals deserving of care. He didn't have answers, but he had questions now, and questions were often where change began. Word spread through the servant network with the peculiar speed of information that people aren't supposed to share, but can't help discussing. By morning assembly the next day, Marcus could feel the attention focused on him. Not obvious stares, but the subtle awareness that comes from being the subject of whispered conversations. Naive stood in the housekeeping ranks with improved posture, her weight distributed evenly between both legs. She caught Marcus's eye for half a second, a brief acknowledgement that violated assembly protocol but somehow felt necessary. Overseer Keltain delivered the daily assignments with his usual efficient precision, but Marcus noticed an addition to the standard speech. "Reminder to all staff. Medical care is available through proper administrative channels. Individual servants attempting to provide medical attention without training or authorization create liability concerns that impact household efficiency. Follow established protocols." The statement was general enough to avoid directly naming Marcus, but everyone knew what it referenced. Several servants glanced in his direction. Thelman's warning expression was so pronounced it might as well have been verbal. Marcus kept his face neutral, accepting the implicit reprimand without visible reaction. He'd been noticed. That was both the goal and the problem. The day proceeded normally until mid-afternoon, when Marcus was summoned to Overseer Keltain's office, a space that embodied ascendancy aesthetics, all smooth surfaces and color-shifting walls calibrated to project authority. Keltain sat behind a desk that seemed to float without visible support, his skin cycling through professional blues. "Webb, sit." Marcus sat in the designated chair, maintaining proper posture, and waited. "I've received inquiries about you from multiple department supervisors," Keltain said, consulting his data tablet. "Apparently, your intervention with Naive has created discussion among the staff. Servants are asking questions about medical care access. about whether they can help each other with minor injuries, about whether individual compassion is permitted within household protocols. I apologize if my actions created additional administrative work, Marcus said carefully. That's not an apology, that's a diplomatic deflection. Keltine set down his tablet. I'm going to speak plainly with you, Webb, because your species seems to value directness. You're causing ripples in a system that functions best when static. The ascendancy social structure operates on clearly defined hierarchies. Servants have specified roles. Individual initiative that crosses those roles creates uncertainty, and uncertainty reduces efficiency. I understand the concern, Overseer. However, ignoring someone's suffering when I could easily help seemed wrong, inefficient, even if that person's ability to work is compromised by an untreated injury. Keltine's skin shifted through several rapid color changes. A sign Marcus had learned indicated that the Overseer was processing multiple conflicting thoughts simultaneously. That's surprisingly pragmatic reasoning. You're framing compassion in efficiency terms. Is that not accurate? Healthy workers perform better than injured workers. Treating minor injuries prevents them from becoming major medical issues that would require more resources and time to address. The logic seems straightforward. The logic is sound. The implementation is problematic because it implies that servants should make independent judgments about resource allocation, which undermines administrative oversight. Keltine paused. However, I cannot ignore that Naev's productivity metrics have improved following your intervention. That creates a data point suggesting that selective individual initiative may, under specific circumstances, align with efficiency goals. Marcus waited, uncertain where this conversation was heading. I'm going to implement a pilot program, Keltine continued slowly, as if working through the idea in real time. Basic medical supplies will be made more readily available to staff, with simplified documentation requirements for minor injury treatment. This will be framed as an efficiency optimization, not as a response to your actions. Do you understand the distinction? You're allowing something I did without permission, but officially it has nothing to do with me. Precisely, the ascendancy respects tradition and hierarchy. Direct acknowledgement that a servant-influenced policy would be uncomfortable, but outcomes matter more than pride. Keltine's skin settled into a pale blue that suggested tentative satisfaction. You're dismissed, Webb. Return to your duties. And perhaps, continue being problematically compassionate, but do try to be subtle about it. Marcus left the office trying to process what had just happened. He'd been simultaneously reprimanded and encouraged, told his actions were inappropriate while also being informed they were producing system changes. The ascendancy operated on contradictions that human logic struggled to parse. He returned to the archives, but concentration eluded him. His mind kept replaying the conversation, analyzing Keltine's careful phrasing, wondering if he'd just accidentally become an agent of change in a system designed to resist evolution. Evening brought another shift in the servants' social dynamics. During the meal period, Naev approached Marcus's table directly, no longer maintaining the careful distance that protocol suggested. "May I sit with you?" she asked. "Of course." She settled across from him, her meal tray arranged with the meticulous precision that characterized Kalari culture. "I wanted to tell you something important. My sister works in housekeeping at House Threnodian, one of the other noble families. I sent her a message about what you did, helping me despite having no obligation to do so. She shared it with other servants there. Now I'm receiving messages from servants in multiple households, asking if the story is true, asking if humans really treat others with such consideration, regardless of species or status." Marcus felt simultaneously flattered and uncomfortable with this attention. "I'm not special. Any decent person would have done the same thing." "That's precisely the point," Naev said gently. "You believe that. In human culture, apparently, Compassion is baseline expectation rather than extraordinary exception. That concept it's revolutionary in a society where kindness is rationed based on social position. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now you've become a symbol. Servants across multiple households are talking about the human who helped the Kalari Maid. You represent possibility, the idea that we don't have to accept suffering as inevitable, that we can care for each other even when the system tells us not to. She paused. That's dangerous for you, Webb. Symbols either create change or get crushed by those who fear it. Marcus considered this, thinking about Thelman's warning, about Keltain's complicated acknowledgement, about becoming a focal point for something much larger than his simple act of helping an injured colleague. I don't know how to be a symbol, he admitted. I'm just a guy who works in archives and tries to be decent to people. That's all I ever wanted to be. Sometimes that's enough, Naive said. Sometimes the most profound revolutions start with someone doing something simple that everyone else had convinced themselves was impossible. Over the following days, Marcus noticed subtle changes in the palace's social atmosphere. Servants made slightly more eye contact with each other. The medical supply storage saw increased usage, with documentation showing that staff were treating minor injuries rather than working through pain. Conversations in the common area grew marginally less guarded, people sharing small kindnesses that previously would have seemed too risky. Saris approached Marcus during an afternoon rest period, carrying a container of something that smelled significantly better than standard nutrition paste. I made this in the kitchen during downtime. It's from my homeworld, a traditional dish my family taught me before I entered service. I wanted to share it with you. As thanks, I suppose, for reminding us that we're allowed to be kind. Marcus accepted the container, touched by the gesture. You didn't need to do this. I know, that's why I wanted to. Sarah smiled, a tentative expression that suggested hope was a muscle she was relearning how to use. 3 others in the kitchen have started sharing food with each other too. Small portions, nothing that impacts our duties, but it's nice to remember that we're not just functions, that we're people who can care about each other. The gift represented more than food. It represented a shift in culture, servants reclaiming small pieces of humanity that the palace system had trained them to suppress. Not everyone appreciated these changes. Thelman caught Marcus in the corridor 2 weeks after the initial incident with Naive, his elderly face carrying concern. You've stirred something, young human. The administrative staff are noticing increased interaction among servants. Some of the nobles have commented on improved morale, but also increased independence. That independence makes them nervous. Are they going to crack down? Marcus asked. I don't know. The ascendancy values efficiency above tradition, but they also fear loss of control. You've created a situation where servants are happier and more productive, but also more connected to each other than the system prefers. The outcome is uncertain. Marcus absorbed this, understanding that he'd inadvertently started something that might help people or might bring consequences he couldn't control. What would you do, Thelman, if you were in my position? The elderly servant was quiet for a long moment. I've spent 40 years being invisible, following every rule, never questioning the system. It kept me safe. It also kept me hollow. He met Marcus's eyes directly. If I could do it over, I'd be more like you. I'd choose kindness over safety. But I'm old and tired, and the weight of 4 decades of compliance is hard to shake. You're young enough and human enough that you still believe change is possible. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what the ascendancy needs, someone too naive or too brave to accept that suffering is inevitable. I'm not brave, Marcus said. I'm just stubborn about basic decency. Sometimes those are the same thing. The conversation stayed with Marcus as he returned to the archives, working through historical documents that detailed the ascendancy's expansion across multiple systems, the careful integration of various species into their hierarchical structure. Reading between the lines, he could see the pattern, Efficiency prioritized over individual welfare, collective function valued above personal dignity. It was a system that worked, in the sense that it produced stable government and economic prosperity. But it was also a system that asked people to accept suffering as the price of participation, that treated compassion as a luxury rather than a necessity. Marcus was beginning to understand that his simple act of helping Naive hadn't just been about bandaging a wound. It had been about challenging a fundamental assumption: that kindness should be rationed based on status, that caring for others outside official channels was inappropriate, that suffering should be endured silently rather than addressed through mutual support. He closed the historical documents, his mind too restless for cataloging, and made a decision. He pulled up his personal communication device and began composing a message to the human embassy on the capital world, documenting what he'd observed about servant conditions in House Veltharion, about the small changes that had resulted from one act of compassion, about the potential for broader cultural evolution if the ascendancy's efficiency focus could be redirected toward valuing individual dignity alongside collective productivity. He wasn't sure if anyone would read it, wasn't sure if it would make any difference. But he'd learned over the past weeks that sometimes the most important actions were the ones you took without knowing the outcome, simply because they felt like the right thing to do. The message sent, disappearing into communication networks that spanned star systems, carrying a small piece of hope that change was possible even in societies that had convinced themselves otherwise. Marcus returned to his quarters that evening, exhausted from work and from the emotional weight of becoming an inadvertent symbol for something larger than himself. He lay on his sleep platform, staring at the ceiling, and thought about his mother back on Earth who'd raised him with simple principles. Help people who need it, treat everyone with dignity, don't accept cruelty just because it's convenient. She'd never imagined those principles would become revolutionary acts in an alien palace thousands of light years from home. But here he was, trying to live by values that his culture had taught him were basic, and discovering that basic decency could be radical depending on context. Tomorrow, he'd return to the archives. He'd catalog documents and maintain proper servant protocols, and try to be invisible when invisibility was strategically useful. But he wouldn't stop helping people who needed it, wouldn't stop treating others with the compassion that his humanity demanded, regardless of what the ascendancy's efficiency calculations suggested was appropriate. Sometimes, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, the most important revolution was the one where you simply refused to stop being kind. The formal banquet 3 weeks later was one of those elaborate affairs that House Veltharion hosted to demonstrate their status within the ascendancy hierarchy. Nobles from multiple families attended, dressed in ceremonial attire that shifted colors with their moods, creating a constantly moving palette of social signaling that Marcus had learned to ignore while serving. His role at such events was minor, assisting the archival documentation team in recording the event for historical purposes, managing the holographic recording equipment, being generally useful while remaining invisible. He'd performed this function a dozen times, comfortable with the routine of observing without participating. Naive was serving at the main table, moving between guests with the practiced efficiency that characterized her work. Her leg had fully healed, her movements fluid and confident. Marcus noticed her in passing, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement that she returned with the smallest smile. The banquet proceeded normally for the first hour. Nobles discussed politics and trade agreements while servants moved through carefully choreographed patterns, ensuring glasses stayed filled and dishes appeared and disappeared with seamless timing. Then Naive approached Lady Scythia Veltharion, a younger member of the noble family known for her artistic accomplishments and volatile temperament, carrying a wine decanter. Her 6-fingered hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps the formal banquet's pressure got to her. Perhaps it was just one of those small human, or kelari, moments of imperfection that happen to everyone. The tremor caused a splash of wine to land on the tablecloth near Lady Scythia's plate. Not on her clothing, not even particularly close to her person, just a small stain on expensive fabric that could be easily cleaned. Lady Scythia's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. She stood abruptly, her skin flashing through angry reds and oranges, and struck Naive across the face with enough force that the sound echoed through the suddenly silent banquet hall. Naive fell, catching herself with her hands, her face already showing the marks of the blow. The room held its collective breath. Nobles watched with expressions ranging from approval to mild interest. Servants froze in their positions, eyes downcast, understanding that to react would be to invite similar punishment. This was normal. This was acceptable. This was how the ascendancy maintained discipline among servant classes, swift, physical correction for mistakes that disrupted noble comfort. Marcus moved before his brain fully processed the decision. He was across the room in seconds, positioning himself between Lady Scythia and Naive, not aggressively but firmly, his body language communicating protection rather than threat. He helped Naive to her feet with gentle hands, supporting her weight, his eyes meeting Lady Scythia's with direct attention that violated every protocol about servants maintaining deferential posture. The silence intensified, becoming almost physical in its weight. A servant had just interfered with a noble's disciplinary action. The social violation was so profound that nobody quite knew how to respond. It was like watching physics laws break, something that shouldn't be possible happening right in front of them. Lady Scythia stared at Marcus with an expression that cycled through shock, outrage, and confusion in rapid succession. Her skin flashed through colors so quickly it was almost strobing. What are you doing? Step aside immediately." Marcus didn't step aside. He kept one hand on Naive's shoulder, steadying her, and addressed Lady Scythia with as much respect as he could manage while his heart hammered against his ribs. "With respect, my lady, she made an accident, a small one. The punishment seems disproportionate to the offense. You dare question my judgment. You dare interfere with household discipline." Lady Scythia's voice rose. "Overseer Keltine, remove this human immediately. He's forgotten his place." Before Keltine could move from his position near the entrance, another voice cut through the tension. "Wait." Lord Carith Veltharion, the family patriarch and head of House Veltharion, stood from his position at the head of the table. He was elderly by ascendancy standards, his skin showing the pale blue that indicated advanced age, but his presence commanded immediate attention. He approached Marcus and Naive with measured steps, each footfall deliberate, the entire banquet hall tracking his movement. When he reached them, he studied Marcus with the intensity of someone encountering a genuinely novel situation. "Human servant," Lord Carith said, his voice carrying the harmonic qualities that marked high-status ascendancy citizens. "You have committed a profound breach of protocol. You have interfered with disciplinary actions that are within Lady Scythia's rights to administer. You have placed yourself between a noble and a servant in a manner that suggests you consider yourself authorized to make judgments about appropriate conduct." Marcus felt his mouth go dry but maintained eye contact. "Yes, my lord, I understand I've broken protocol." "Then why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, genuine rather than rhetorical. Lord Carith seemed actually curious about the answer. Marcus took a breath, aware that his next words would either justify his actions or condemn him, possibly both. "Because where I come from, you don't stand by and watch people get hurt if you can prevent it. Because Naive," he caught himself using her name, another protocol violation. "Because she didn't deserve to be struck for an accident. Because compassion isn't something you ration based on status or species. Because—" He trailed off, then finished simply, "because that's what humans do. We help each other. We care about each other, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's dangerous, especially then." The silence that followed felt eternal. Lord Carith studied Marcus with an expression that was impossible to read. Finally, he spoke, his words measured and careful. You believe that your cultural values supersede our established social structures. I believe that kindness and dignity should be universal, my lord, not privileges granted based on hierarchy. That's a radical philosophy. It's a human philosophy. Lord Carith turned to Naive, who stood trembling slightly, her face still showing the mark of Lady Scythia's strike. Servant, are you injured? Naive seemed shocked to be addressed directly by the patriarch. My face hurts, my lord, but I can continue my duties. That's not what I asked. Are you injured? Yes, my lord, slightly. Lord Carith was silent for another long moment. Then he did something that created audible gasps throughout the banquet hall. He turned to Lady Scythia and said, quietly but clearly, Daughter, your response to a minor accident was excessive. I believe an acknowledgement is appropriate. Lady Scythia's skin flashed through shocked purples. Father, you cannot be suggesting. I am not suggesting, I am instructing. His tone carried absolute authority. The human is correct. The punishment was disproportionate to the offense. Acknowledge this. The battle of wills between father and daughter lasted several seconds. Finally, Lady Scythia turned to Naive with obvious reluctance. Your service is adequate. The spillage was unintentional. I acknowledge that my response was perhaps stronger than necessary. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't an admission of equal status. But within the context of ascendancy social structure, it was revolutionary. Lord Carith addressed the assembled nobles. Let it be noted that House Veltharion values efficiency and productivity above rigid tradition. If servant morale and well-being contribute to better service, and recent household metrics suggest they do, then perhaps our disciplinary protocols require examination. I instruct the household administration to review current practices and recommend modifications that optimize both efficiency and dignity. He looked at Marcus when he said that last word, something approaching approval in his expression. As for you, human servant, Lord Carith continued, you have committed serious protocol violations. However, you have also demonstrated principles that, while foreign to our culture, have produced measurable improvements in household function. You are dismissed from this banquet but not from service. Return to your quarters and reflect on how to maintain your compassionate impulses, while also respecting established structures. It's a balance you'll need to learn if you wish to continue your employment here. Marcus helped Naive toward the servant's exit, his legs shaking slightly from adrenaline crash. As they reached the doorway, he heard Lord Carith address the assembled nobles one more time. Perhaps we have become too comfortable with traditions that prioritize control over care. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from species who have not yet absorbed our efficient indifference to suffering. This will be discussed further in council. The banquet resumed, conversations gradually filling the space that silence had occupied, but the social atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Marcus and Naive made their way through the servants' corridors in shocked silence until they reached a quiet alcove far from the formal areas. Naive leaned against the wall, touching her face gingerly, her eyes bright with unshed tears that Marcus suspected were more about emotional overwhelm than physical pain. You risked everything, she said finally. Your position, your safety, possibly your life depending on how Lord Carith chose to respond. Why would you do that for me? Because watching you get hurt and doing nothing, that's insane. Maybe, but it's human insane, and I'm not willing to give that up just because I'm living in a different culture. Naive laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that released tension. You're going to change everything, aren't you? One ridiculous act of kindness at a time. I'm really not trying to change anything. I'm just trying to be decent. In the ascendancy, those are the same thing. Over the following days and weeks, changes rippled through House Veltharion with increasing momentum. Lord Carith's public acknowledgement that servant well-being impacted efficiency created space for reforms that had been unthinkable before. The household administration, led by Overseer Keltine, who seemed simultaneously stressed and intrigued by the evolving situation, implemented new protocols. Medical care became more accessible, with simplified documentation and encouragement for servants to treat minor injuries promptly rather than working through pain. Rest periods were extended slightly to allow for better recovery between shifts. Disciplinary procedures were revised to require proportional responses to mistakes, with oversight from administrative staff rather than immediate physical correction. Most significantly, a formal complaint system was established where servants could report excessive treatment without fear of retaliation, something that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. Not all nobles approved. Some left House Veltharian's service in protest, claiming the patriarch had gone soft, had allowed alien values to corrupt proper ascendancy hierarchy. But others, particularly younger nobles who'd grown up questioning traditional structures, began implementing similar reforms in their own households. Marcus became a figure of complicated status, technically still a low-ranking servant, but also someone whose opinions carried unexpected weight. Keltine consulted him about servant morale initiatives. Other servants sought his advice about navigating the changing protocols. He remained uncomfortable with the attention, but recognized that his visibility created opportunities for others to speak up, to suggest improvements, to imagine that change was possible. Naive healed physically within days, but the psychological impact lasted longer. She sought Marcus out regularly, not out of obligation but genuine friendship, and together they became informal advocates for servant welfare reforms that spread gradually through the palace. 3 months after the banquet incident, Marcus received a communication from the human embassy. They'd read his report about conditions in House Veltharian, about the small revolution that had started with bandaging an injured leg and evolved into systematic cultural change. They wanted to document the process, to understand how one person's refusal to accept suffering as inevitable had created ripples that were now spreading through multiple noble houses across the ascendancy. Marcus sat in his quarters, reading the embassy communication, and felt the weight of what had happened settle on him properly for the first time. He hadn't intended any of this. He just wanted to help someone who was hurt. Everything else, the protocol violations, the banquet confrontation, the cultural reforms, had followed from that simple decision to be kind when kindness wasn't required. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Naive, Saris, and Thelman standing together, an unusual cross-generational, cross-species gathering. "We wanted to thank you," Saris said, speaking for the group, "for reminding us that we matter, that our suffering isn't inevitable, that compassion is possible even in systems designed to discourage it." "I didn't do anything special," Marcus protested, the same response he'd given 100 times. "That's what makes it extraordinary," Thelman said, his elderly face carrying something Marcus had never seen there before: hope. "You treated basic human decency as if it wasn't negotiable, even when everyone told you it was. You showed us that we'd been accepting cruelty not because it was necessary, but because we'd stopped believing alternatives were possible." They stood in his doorway, 3 servants who'd been strangers a few months ago, now bound together by the recognition that change was possible if someone was brave or stubborn enough to start it. Marcus invited them in, and they spent the evening talking about small improvements they'd noticed, about other servants who were beginning to speak up, about the slow evolution of a culture that had prioritized efficiency over humanity and was learning, reluctantly, that the two didn't have to be in opposition. Later, after his visitors left and the palace settled into night-cycle quiet, Marcus stood at his small window looking out over the crystalline spires that housed thousands of beings, nobles and servants, various species, all caught in complex webs of hierarchy and tradition. He thought about his mother's simple lessons about helping people who needed it, about treating everyone with dignity, about not accepting cruelty just because it was convenient. She'd raised him to believe those things were basic, unremarkable, the bare minimum of decent behavior. In the ascendancy, they'd proven to be revolutionary. Marcus didn't know what the future held, didn't know if the reforms would last or if traditional forces would eventually reassert control, didn't know if his actions would be remembered as the start of meaningful change or just a brief anomaly in centuries of established hierarchy. But he knew that tomorrow he'd return to the archives. He'd catalog documents and maintain his duties and try to be a good servant by House Veltharian standards. And if he saw someone suffering, if he encountered pain he could help relieve, he'd help them. Because that's what humans did. Because compassion wasn't negotiable, regardless of what efficiency calculations or social protocols suggested. Sometimes he thought as sleep approached, the most profound impact came not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from the quiet insistence that kindness mattered, that dignity wasn't a privilege to be earned but a right to be recognized, that suffering wasn't inevitable just because a system had decided it was acceptable. The palace lights dimmed to night cycle settings, and somewhere in the servants' quarters, people slept slightly more peacefully knowing that someone cared enough to challenge a galaxy that had forgotten how to be kind. It was a small victory, but small victories accumulated over time could reshape worlds. Marcus closed his eyes, exhausted and hopeful in equal measure, and let sleep claim him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to prove that humanity's greatest gift wasn't technology or strength or political cunning. It was simply the stubborn, unreasonable, absolutely necessary belief that everyone deserved care, regardless of status or species or social convenience. And sometimes, that belief was enough to change everything.